On my retirement day, my boss handed me a meager $50 as my pension and said, "According to your contract, this is your pension. Now pack up and leave." I was stunned but maintained my composure and did exactly as he instructed. I grabbed my laptop and rewrote the code for the entire car tracking system I had developed. The very next day he called me 66 times, but that was exactly what my contract said. Clean up, pack up, and leave behind not a single dime. After 30 long years of dedication, the company I'd given my life to owed me nothing more than this paltry pension. Meanwhile, Steven Tyler, the young, smug, second-generation heir and current president, mocked me as if all my hard work meant nothing. His attitude left me feeling empty and completely disheartened. Any bond one once had with this company was gone. It had transformed into a faceless corporation that no longer cared about its employees. I didn't argue. I just nodded, accepted the packet he handed me, and said, "Understood." Then, I headed straight for the systems management room, where I erased all the data from the company's management system. You might think it was a cruel act, but it was clearly stated in the contract as part of my responsibilities under the president's orders. That was my final task. Moments later, chaos erupted in the office. "Hey, I can't send emails. What's going on?" someone exclaimed. "I can't access the internal system either," another voice joined in, and the place buzzed with confusion and panic. Then the president himself stormed over, pale and visibly shaken. "Steven, what's happening here? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. I turned to face him calmly. That was the moment when my long-standing tension with the company's second-generation president truly began. "My name is Steven William. I'm 50 years old and have spent nearly my entire life with this organization. I joined right after high school, making me the longest-serving employee here in an age when people change jobs all the time. My loyalty made me something of an anomaly. As the manager of systems management, my job was always challenging, yet I found it deeply rewarding over the years. As my younger colleagues grew more skilled, I ended up handling less work directly. Life felt good and I was proud of what I had built. One day, one of my most capable juniors, Samuel, approached me with a worried look. "Mr. William, I think there's a mistake here, but I'm not sure what's causing it," he said, pointing at his screen. I peered over his shoulder. "This code isn't right." "Here's how it should be," I explained, fixing the error. Samuel beamed at me. "Thank you, Mr. William. I don't know what we'd do without you." I smiled back. "Soon enough, you'll be running this place. I'm counting on you." Samuel laughed nervously. "I'm not ready for that yet." "What do you mean?" I replied. "I'll be 50 soon, so I've been thinking about my retirement." Samuel shook his head. "You still have over a decade left, Mr. William. Why are you even talking about retiring in your 30s? He didn't yet understand how fast time flies. Still, I assured him I planned to work hard until my very last day. There was so much more I wanted to accomplish. Back then I felt satisfied and proud of my career. But everything changed abruptly when Ethan Tyler, the company's founder and president, fell gravely ill and was hospitalized. His condition worsened suddenly, leaving no hope for recovery. In his absence, his only son, Steven, swiftly assumed the presidency. He wasted no time delivering an emotional inaugural speech. "This situation has shocked us all, but it's time to unite and move forward together. We'll bring about the changes this company needs to thrive." At first, his enthusiasm was contagious, and his charismatic words lifted everyone's spirits. I'd known him briefly during his stint at a subsidiary, and I truly believed he could continue his father's legacy. But my optimism didn't last long. Soon after taking over, Steven began cutting costs and focusing solely on efficiency. His sweeping changes involved sudden reorganizations, mass layoffs, and transfers that threw the entire office into disarray. The most heartbreaking part was how he treated long-serving senior employees. Instead of valuing our experience, he saw us as obstacles to the growth of younger workers. Rather than firing us outright, he demoted us to lower roles and slashed our pay. Skilled salespeople were reassigned to desk jobs, while support staff who couldn't handle the new roles eventually quit out of sheer frustration. Meanwhile, younger employees were promoted at breakneck speed, often without the skills or experience their new positions required. First, I tried to rationalize it. If the younger workers were genuinely talented, maybe it made sense. But the truth was, their performance reviews didn't match their capabilities. Talented young employees, disillusioned by the blatant favoritism, left in droves. Those who stayed were mostly the president's loyal cronies, reaping undeserved perks. Then one of my most trusted colleagues, one of our top salespeople who had consistently boosted revenue, announced he was leaving. As he packed up, he smiled faintly and said, "Thank you for everything, Steven." I forced a smile, trying to keep my emotions in check, and asked, "Why are you leaving? You're so good at what you do." He let out a heavy sigh and replied, "I'm just tired of giving my all to this place. It doesn't feel worth it anymore." Then he looked at me and added, "But Steven, you're the backbone of this company. No one else can manage the systems like you do. Hang in there." He grinned, probably trying to lighten the mood. I felt tears well up in my eyes, and though I tried to smile back, my heart ached. I wanted to wave him off with a cheerful farewell, but all I could do was watch him disappear into the distance. I had seen colleagues and friends walk away so many times that you'd think a mass exodus would spark a rebellion, but nothing ever did. One by one, talented employees left, leaving behind only those who were overworked, resigned to their fate, or utterly loyal to President Stephen. I remained one of the determined ones, still clinging to the company I once loved, even though it was clear that it was on a downward spiral. Signs of decline were everywhere, and even President Stephen seemed increasingly uneasy. "This is just a temporary setback," I overheard him telling his supporters one day. "It's like crouching before a big leap forward. We'll bounce back soon." I couldn't believe the arrogance in his words, especially when everyone around him echoed his sentiments without a hint of self-doubt. It was obvious he wasn't willing to admit his mistakes. Frustrated, I returned to the systems management room, where Samuel was waiting. "Mr. William, there's big news," Samuel said excitedly. "The president is coming to inspect the systems management room today." "What a surprise," I muttered. "After all the personnel changes, he's now looking to cut costs in our department. He might even target the systems themselves." I sighed, trying to hide my unease. "There's not much we can do, Samuel. President Stephen has a habit of making cuts in critical areas. It's good he's enthusiastic, but his priorities are completely off." Not long after, President Stephen arrived. He strode into the room, his eyes scanning everything as if he were trying to figure out what we actually did here. "Isn't the air conditioning set too high?" he suddenly asked. "Heating and cooling costs are significant, you know," I replied calmly. "Computers are sensitive to heat, so this temperature is necessary for management purposes." He gave a half-hearted nod but seemed uninterested in my explanation. Ignoring me, he turned his attention to Samuel and began firing off questions. For some reason, he completely overlooked the fact that I was the manager. After wandering around for a while, he finally turned to me. "Stephen, right?" "Yes, Mr. President," I replied, surprised he even remembered my name. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. 30 years, I answered. 30 years, that's quite a long time," he said, his tone overly casual and almost dismissive. I kept my composure. "I noticed your base salary is rather high. Was that part of your original employment terms?" he continued. "Yes, it was," I replied firmly. "Well, Samuel here is managing the system now too, isn't he?" he prodded. "Yes," I said, although his comment unsettled me. This was my first one-on-one conversation with the president, and despite my reservations, I decided to offer some advice. "Mr. President, I strongly recommend not replacing the current system. With all the recent personnel changes, many employees are still adjusting to their new roles. Switching systems now would only reduce efficiency further." President Stephen raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. Before I could elaborate, he cut me off sharply. "That's for me to decide." I fell silent. His sudden harshness was unexpected. I'd never seen him talk down to anyone like that before. "A worker like you challenging the president's decisions, you need to remember your place," he sneered. "I'm sorry," I muttered, a mix of anger and frustration in my voice. He smirked and added, "You're the manager, right, Stephen? Don't worry. I'll think this through thoroughly, just like I do with the system." His tone dripped with sarcasm as he walked out. Samuel, who had been watching the entire exchange nervously, let out a sigh of relief once the president was gone. "That was intense, Mr. William. You're incredible," Samuel said. I shook my head. "I'm sorry, Samuel. I didn't mean to create such an awkward situation." "No, it's okay," he replied quickly. "Honestly, your viewpoint makes a lot of sense, but the president is incredibly frustrating. What's going through his mind? Probably nothing good." I scowled, and Samuel and I sat quietly, both deep in thought. After that day, we decided to have an honest conversation about our future plans. It seemed like the best course of action given the state of the company. A month later, I was summoned to the president's office. When I arrived, President Stephen greeted me with a forced smile. "Stephen, thank you for all your hard work over the years," he began. I nodded politely, unsure of where this was headed. Then he dropped the bombshell. "We've decided to let you go." I stared at him in disbelief. "What did you just say?" I asked. "It's not personal," he said with a grin. "It's strictly business." He handed me a small packet, adding, "This is your pension." The envelope he gave me looked cheap, and something about it felt wrong. Why wasn't the payment processed through a bank transfer? Still in shock, I opened it to find a single coin inside a dime. "Mr. President, this isn't funny, not even as a joke," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "Oh, it's no joke," he replied coolly. He pulled out a document and placed it on my desk. "Take a look at this," he said. I recognized it immediately. It was the employment contract I'd signed 30 years ago when I first joined the company. President Stephen tapped a specific section with his finger. "Look here," he said smugly. "Your employer pension is listed as 10. My eyes widened in shock. Next to the original pension clause, someone had scribbled 10 in ballpoint pen. a handwriting that was clearly different from the printed text. Grinning triumphantly, he traced over the handwritten number. See? I didn't write this, it was already there. Amusing, isn't it? But you did sign and stamp this contract, didn't you? I opened my mouth to object, but he cut me off. This is all by the book, he said firmly. Clean up and leave. The contract made it clear that there was no room for argument. I realized then that I'd been on his radar for some time. I was the long-serving employee he wanted to push out, the symbol of the old guard he despised. The only reason I hadn't been targeted earlier was my control over the company systems. But after his last visit to the system management room, he must have decided that Samuel was capable enough to take over. My honest advice that day had probably rubbed him the wrong way. What a petty, narrow-minded man, I thought. A company led by someone like him had no future. I forced a smile and said, "Understood," then walked out, stuffing the flimsy envelope into my pocket. My next stop was the system management room, where Samuel was waiting, just as we had planned. "It's time, Samuel," I said calmly. He nodded, his face serious. "I'm ready." We sat at our computers and began dismantling the system. Erasing it was much easier than building it, and before long everything was wiped clean. Soon the office erupted into chaos. I could hear panicked voices. "Hey, I can't send emails. The internal system isn't working. What's happening?" The confusion spread quickly. I cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. People were running around, completely lost and unsure what to do. It wasn't long before President Stephen appeared, pale and frantic. "Stephen," he yelled, his voice mixing anger and desperation. "What did you do?" I turned to face him, calm and composed. "I did exactly what you asked, Mr. President," I replied. "What do you mean, your personal belongings? Why did you delete the system?" "Since the system belonged to me, I removed it," I explained. "I was just tidying up what I had contributed to the company." "What are you talking about?" he demanded, looking even more confused. I pulled out the same contract he had shown me earlier. "It's all here," I said, pointing to a specific clause. "This system isn't company property. My salary over the years covered its loan, and the agreement was that I'd return it when I left. You've had this document on file for 30 years. Stephen stared at the contract, clearly flustered. "What is this nonsense? It's ridiculous that one employee leaving can bring down the entire system." I fought the urge to point out how absurd it was that my pension was worth just a dime. Instead, I kept my voice steady. "If you cancel my dismissal, I'll return both the system and your dime." He slammed the contract onto the desk. "Samuel, restore the system immediately," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. Samuel hesitated for a moment, then quickly replied, "Yes, sir. I'll get started right away, but it will take time." "I don't care how long it takes. Just do it." President Stephen barked. As Samuel began the restoration process, I stood quietly for a moment and exchanged a glance with him. I decided it was time for me to leave. I walked out of the system management room, a place where I'd spent so many years, my mind buzzing with determination. This wasn't over. A few days later, while I was relaxing at home, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was the company's main number. I answered, and the first thing I heard was President Stephen's voice. "Stephen," he said, sounding exhausted. "We're in trouble. Samuel is struggling to restore the system and nothing is working. We've already lost days of productivity, even the weekend." I could almost hear the desperation in his voice, a far cry from the smug tone in his office. "So, what do you want me to do about it?" I asked, suppressing a laugh. "Sell us the system," he said. "I'll pay you $100,000, no $200,000. I couldn't help but laugh. "President, you have no idea what that system is worth. Do you?" "That's nothing." "What do you mean, nothing? Then how much do you want?" I said bluntly, $1 million. His voice cracked and I could almost picture the shock on his face. "Yes, $1 million, I repeated, keeping my tone steady. "Even at that price, you're getting a bargain. That system is worth far more." "This is outrageous," he snapped. "That's more than your entire pension, which, as you recall, was just 10. I replied dryly. Realizing he wasn't taking me seriously, I dropped the playful tone. "President Stephen, I mean it. If you don't pay $1 million, you won't get the system back, and I won't help Samuel restore it either." A long silence followed. Then in an icy tone he finally said, "I won't give in to your ridiculous demands. How dare you ask for such an outrageous sum, you ungrateful man." He then hung up. I put down the phone, feeling a mix of disappointment and resolve. It was clear this man was unfit to lead the company. I picked up the phone again, ready to move forward with the next phase of my plan. The next day, loud shouting erupted from the president's office. The sound came from Stephen, now a former president, slamming his fist on the desk. "Why am I being fired?" he demanded, his voice shaking with outrage. Standing before him was Ethan Tyler, his father. Although Ethan hadn't fully recovered from his illness, his presence was commanding. Watching from the doorway, I couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration. "I'm not firing you," Ethan replied sternly. I'm demoting you to a regular employee. You need to start over and learn from the ground up. Stephen looked appalled. A former president working as an ordinary employee was humiliating. Ethan slammed his hand on the desk, making Stephen flinch and stand upright. You should be ashamed of the chaos you've caused. You nearly destroyed this company. Ethan bellowed, unleashing his frustration. I was a fool to believe your reports, he continued. I warned you not to interfere with personnel decisions, yet you forced out so many trusted people, including Stephen. At the mention of my name, Stephen turned his glare toward me. He knew I had played a role in his downfall. His reckless actions had become intolerable, and I had taken steps to alert Ethan about the situation. Even though I felt guilty for disturbing Ethan during his recovery, I sent him a detailed report about what was happening under Stephen's leadership. Ethan, who had trusted Stephen's updates without question, was shocked when he read my account. Realizing the company was on the brink of collapse, he returned to the office despite still needing treatment. Later he told me, "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Stephen, my foolish son, would have destroyed the company I built." I knew then that I had done the right thing. Samuel and I had carefully planned our actions. We knew that if things continued as they were, I'd eventually be forced out too. So we made the management system unusable, putting pressure on Stephen and his unresponsive supporters. It was the only form of resistance we in the systems department could muster. As expected, the chaos that followed the shutdown was immense. Stephen couldn't handle the situation, and even his staunchest supporters began to lose faith in him. For the first time, hardworking employees spoke up. Resign. Bring back President Ethan. The protests grew louder until Stephen was brought before the board. The criticism he faced was harsh but justified. The board called out his poor treatment of long-serving employees, his mishandling of layoffs, and the chaos caused by the system failure. During the meeting, one board member remarked, "If we can purchase that system permanently for $1 million, it's a bargain. Why didn't the president buy it? Rebuilding it from scratch would cost far more in time and money." Hearing their appreciation for my work filled me with pride. All those years I had spent developing and maintaining the system had not been in vain. After the board's decision, Stephen was demoted. Back in the president's office, he sat across from Ethan with his head hung low. "I'm sorry," he said reluctantly, glancing at me, the apology stiff and his dissatisfaction still visible. I simply replied, "Yeah." Ethan then turned to me. "Stephen, I'm truly sorry for all the trouble. Will you consider coming back to the company?" He looked genuinely anxious, and his sincerity touched me. I smiled and said, "Yes, I'll come back as long as you're the one in charge." "Thank you," Ethan said, relief evident in his voice. Then he asked, "Should we go ahead and pay the $1 million for the system?" I replied, "That won't be necessary. You've already given me so much over the years." Ethan laughed and I joined in. Later, back in the system management room, Samuel looked at me with admiration. "I'm glad everything worked out, Mr. William. I was so nervous about how it would all turn out. You went through a lot too. You even had to work over the weekend because of all this," I said. Samuel shook his head with a smile. "If it means making the company a better place, I'd give up my weekends anytime. Besides, all I really did was pretend I couldn't fix the system." I chuckled. "Your acting was perfect. It was the key to resolving everything." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Stephen was terrible though, offering you a 10 pension and even faking the contract. That's just unbelievable." I hesitated, then added, "Actually, there's something you should know about that handwritten 10 in the contract. I wrote it myself." Samuel's eyes widened. "What? What do you mean?" I smiled, sensing his curiosity. "Let me tell you a story. A story about my younger self and how I ended up here. It's something I've never shared before. Back in middle and high school, I was a loner. I couldn't fit in and struggled to communicate with others. Most of my time was spent alone in my room. Tinkering with my computer, it became my world, my escape. I developed original source codes and built systems from scratch. One day, Ethan Tyler, a friend of my father's, heard about my work. He recognized my talent and offered me a job as a systems manager at his company. For someone like me, who had been shut away for years, his belief in my abilities meant everything. Not only did he value my work, but he also offered me a salary far above what any high school graduate could expect. Ethan's faith in me gave me a chance to step into the world, and for that I'll always be grateful. I still remember the day Ethan offered me that unusually high salary. Even as a young man, I knew the amount spoke volumes about his belief in me. He offered me more than I felt I deserved. "I can't accept this much," I told him honestly, but Ethan simply shook his head. "This is still a modest offer," he replied. "Our company is just getting started and this is all we can afford right now. As we grow, you'll get raises. Is your system that valuable?" His words left me stunned. In a moment of impulsiveness and youthful innocence, I took the contract he handed me and scribbled something with a ballpoint pen. I wrote 10 next to the term employer pension. Ethan's eyes widened when he saw what I had written. 10? He asked in surprise. "Yes," I said earnestly. I already feel guilty accepting such a high salary every month. I don't want extra money when I leave. That's my idea of fairness. Perhaps amused by my reasoning, Ethan gave a gentle smile. Think of it this way, he said. Consider this system as a loan to the company. I'll include that in your contract and later prepare a formal document. When you leave, you can take the system back, but if we need it, we'll buy it from you. Wouldn't that act as your employer pension? I nodded, realizing how clever the arrangement was. You noticed that right away, Ethan added with a warm chuckle. You're remarkably sharp. His laughter put me at ease, and at that moment I decided to follow his lead no matter what. He'd seen something in me when I was at my lowest, and his belief pulled me out of my shell. After I finished recounting the story to Samuel, he let out a deep breath. So that's what happened between you and the president, he said, his voice full of awe. Yeah, I replied. But I never imagined that contract would come back to haunt us because of Stephen. As for Stephen, he didn't last long at the company. After his demotion, unable to bear working as a regular employee, he resigned and started a business with a friend. Later, Ethan told me that Stephen's venture was struggling financially and wasn't going well. Even after recovering and resuming full-time leadership, Ethan faced countless challenges. I could only hope that Stephen wouldn't disrupt his father's work any further. I need to let him learn the hard way, Ethan said firmly one day. It's like a lion throwing its cub into the valley to teach it how to survive. I doubted Stephen would ever ask for help, even if he needed it, since he chose to quit on his own, too proud to admit defeat. With Ethan back in charge, the company slowly regained its energy and focus. Samuel and I worked tirelessly to make up for lost time, developing a new system that was more efficient and user-friendly. Things were finally starting to feel right again. Then one day, during a visit to Ethan's office, I received unexpected news. What do you want me to do? I asked, curious about the meeting's purpose. Ethan leaned back in his chair and smiled. I want you to work as an executive, he said simply. I froze. An executive? I echoed. Yes, he continued, his tone serious yet kind. You're my right-hand man now. Eventually, I'd like you to become the executive vice president. I hope you'll work alongside me as we rebuild this company. The weight of his words hit me hard. Executive vice president? I murmured. The title carried immense responsibility. It meant overseeing the entire organization and standing as my closest advisor. Do you really think I'm suited for a role like this? I asked hesitantly. Ethan's gaze softened as it always did when he sensed my doubts. The next generation is ready, aren't they? He said, referring to Samuel and the younger employees we'd been mentoring. I nodded. I'm confident Samuel can handle it. There's no issue there. Then let's get started, Ethan said with a smile. We need to prepare for the shareholders' meeting and finalize your executive appointment contract. When he used the word contract, we both chuckled. Just make sure you don't write 10 on this one, he teased. Oh, don't worry, I won't, I replied, laughing along with him. The warmth in the room was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a deep sense of hope and belonging. As I left Ethan's office, a thought struck me. Could I, as an executive, help bring back some of my colleagues who left in despair? That idea filled me with determination. I was grateful I had fought to defend this company, even when the odds were stacked against me. This company had given me a chance to step out of my isolated world and find happiness under an open sky. It wasn't just a workplace, but a place that connected people from the past, present, and future. Walking back to my office, I felt the cool breeze of a new beginning. For the first time, I was moving forward, ready to embrace what lay ahead.